Well, Christmas is in 20 days. I don't know if that excites you or makes you anxious. Maybe you're ready for all those things. Maybe you still have a ton of presents to get, or you have a lot of things on your schedule that individually they're good, but you're like, oh, I'm ready for some break. You know, you've probably been there before. But Christmas is in 20 days, and I've thought before of, well, why is it on December 25th? Why do we celebrate Christmas on that day? And there's always a history and a legacy of choosing the specific dates. In 525, Pope John I commissioned Dionysius the Humble. I don't know how you get the Humble as the end of your name there, but commissioned him to discern the year Jesus was born. And so he chose, got to zero or whatever, however you get there on the calendar. But most scholars think he was wrong. In fact, they were confused at some of the mistakes he made because Romans were very good at keeping records. And through history, we know that Rome had a census taken in year 20 BC, in 6 BC, and 8 AD. Very clear. And if we come to the Gospel of Luke and we hear about the census, we would kind of conclude that those correlate a little bit. So he was off. But really, nobody really cared. And part of the reason nobody cared, I mean, they cared, but it wasn't something that was do or die, per se. It wasn't that important because Easter was the big deal for the church. I mean, Easter was the celebration, and everything else was subservient to that. Everything else was less important than Easter. Now, in our world today, Christmas has become so commercialized that Christmas is kind of the big deal. Now, there are theological debates on is Christmas or Easter more important, and you can get the Pentecost in there. You can do the resurrection or the death of Jesus. You can take stances on those things. But my point is that society has elevated Christmas to add all of these things. And so we put so much pressure on Christmas, which is good. It's important that we celebrate Christmas. But why the 25th? Why do we do it this time? And there were many debates over when it should be, and a common one was in the springtime. The Roman spring equinox was around March 25th, and so that was a suggestion of the spring equinox represents rebirth and new life, and that would make sense to celebrate Jesus and his birth as life. And there were many other thoughts, and hey, we should do it here or here because of this or that. But Theophilus of Antioch in the late 2nd century was the first one that we have recorded to say, hey, we should do it on December 25th. And part of his reasoning was because of this Persian god called Mithra. Now Mithra, or Mithras, depending on where you get it from, has a lot of similarities to Jesus. One of the things is that he was born in a cave. And Jesus was born, we assume, in a cave-type setting or stable. He was also the son of a god. Now, he was more of a demigod than a full-fledged god, but he was still connected to a god. He had a last supper, or a last feast, with some of his close followers. He also brought salvation to all the world. Now, he did it by sacrificing a bull. Not much of a sacrifice when you compare it to Jesus. But the reality is, there was a similarity there. And also, he ascended into heaven on a fiery chariot. And so he ascended that way, and he went up to heaven. And part of the thought process of doing it around this time, around the shortest day of the year, was to show that Jesus is the light, but also to get rid of some of these pagan festivals so we can get our mind off of those and focus on Jesus. Now, we could debate if December 25th is really the right time that we should celebrate Christmas. At this point, it's probably more annoying to change than anything, right? That would be difficult to adjust the calendar. We have Christmas break for our schools, and when we have holidays, and we have all these things already set in place that it would be difficult to celebrate or to change the celebration. So we come here today on December 5th knowing that Christmas is in 20 days. And I hope we take the time to anticipate Christmas. That even though Easter was the big deal for the early church, and Easter is a big deal still, we need to make sure Christmas becomes a big deal for the correct reasons. We need to make sure that we don't allow other things to cause us to miss it, because there are small details in the Christmas story that can change us, that can influence us, that can impact us as we move forward. And so we come to Luke chapter 2. In the traditional Christmas story, there are parts from Matthew 2 that we bring in to fill out the story, I guess we could say. But in Luke chapter 2, we find the traditional Christmas story, because at that time, the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that a census should be taken throughout the entire Roman world. This was the first census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all returned to their own ancestral town to register for the census. And because Joseph was a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, David's ancient home. He traveled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee, and he took with him Mary, to whom he was engaged, who was now expecting a child. We're familiar with this story. We know it. We know that the Romans had issued a census which put all of these things into effect. All the dominoes were aligned, and now it was ready to everything go into effect. And so Joseph went to Bethlehem, went to his hometown, and everyone had to obey. When the emperor said something, there may have been a senate and some representatives, but when the emperor said something, you had to do it. There was really nothing around it. There was no appeals process. The emperor issued a decree. That's what had to happen. But with Rome in a lot of ways wasn't very picky. They wanted to make sure in the census that every person was counted. They didn't care where you were. So from the Roman perspective, Joseph did not have to go to Bethlehem. He didn't have to travel there. That was a Jewish custom. That from a Jewish perspective, he had to go to Bethlehem, to his ancient home, and be counted there. Rome didn't care about that. That was something that Joseph did on his own, but also Mary joined him. And neither Roman law or Jewish law or Roman custom or Jewish custom, nothing required Mary to go with Joseph. But she did. She went with him, and they went on this journey to Bethlehem. And we find, as we continue in the story, that while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. And she wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no lodging available to them. As we're reading along in the Gospel of Luke, this is chapter 2. In chapter 1, we know that the child Mary is carrying is Jesus. So there's no surprise here. This has already been prophesied. The angel has already visited Mary. She knows that this baby is Jesus. And this baby fulfills Old Testament prophecies, fulfills many of them, but particularly when we look at this part of the story, we find that Jesus fulfills the prophecy in Micah chapter 2 that says, "But you, O Bethlehem, are only a small village among all the people of Judah, yet a ruler of Israel, whose origins are in the distant past, will come from you on my behalf." So Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament prophecy from Micah chapter 5, verse 2, of being born in Bethlehem. He came from Bethlehem. Jesus is fulfilling that. But we know the scene. We know there's no lodging available to them. I'm not sure if you've ever been on a trip and you can't find a hotel with vacancies. It's pretty anxious, pretty anxiety-ridden. Now today, with smartphones and technology, there's less of a chance of that, or more options that you can find. Because it's always fun when you finally find a place that has a vacancy and you stay there and it's real crummy, and the next day you drive half a mile down the street and you see a great place that you could have stayed at. Right? That's always fun. But when we think of what Mary and Joseph were going through, it was probably a bit of a scramble. Oh wait, there's no place for us to stay. What are we going to do? How are we going to fix this? Now, for us, staying in a stable or a cave, that would push us pretty far out of our comfort zone. There may be a few of you that could handle that, but I think most of us would just be extremely uncomfortable, to say the least. That's not something that we do, that we're not the rugged outdoors type like they were comparatively in the first century here. But she lays Jesus in a manger. It's a makeshift crib, I guess you could say, because there was no place for him. The animal pen, the animal eating spot was the only place for Jesus. But here's, Here's the point I want to stress today, is that Jesus can make any vessel holy. That crib, that feeding trough, that manger was made holy because of Jesus. But what is the manger? And I want to explore this a little bit today. Manger in Latin means to chew and French to eat. Manger is just a feeding trough where they put the food for animals. Cows, donkeys, horses, camels, goats, any animals, sheep, they would have a feeding trough. That's what it was for the animals. I fear sometimes we have sanitized this situation to say, well, it was a feeding trough, but it was super clean. The bedding was really comfortable. Jesus wasn't put out too much. We make it clean. We make it nice. We make it neat. We probably make it smell good, too, if we're going that far. This is a stable, an animal pen where Jesus was. And most stables of this nature were just kind of caves that if the opening was wide, they'd stack rocks in front to make a narrow opening so it would be a safe spot for their animals. Now, the modern scenes show mangers as this kind of wooden little box thing. And there were wooden box mangers back then, but the only ones we have that still exist today from back then are stone that are carved out or hollowed out somehow. Obviously, wood wouldn't last that long. As you can think of 2,000 years, that piece of wood just wouldn't continue to exist. But there are wooden and stone mangers. But we see that the scene is cold. It's dark. It's wet. He's in a cave. Usually those aren't real dry places. They can be very moist and humid. There were a lot of smells going around with all the animals, a lot of other things that were involved. Now, instead, we kind of sanitize the situation sometimes, but let's make sure we don't try to harp too much on Mary and Joseph. They did the best. I'm confident they did the best with what they could. Mary and Joseph probably cleaned up as much as they could, probably organized it, probably had the manger as padded and safe and as dry as possible. So I just want to say, I don't think Mary and Joseph were bad parents, but don't romanticize the situation. Don't glorify it saying, oh, how nice would that have been. No, I have not met anybody that would be happy to have their child in a stable, in a manger, in a cave, and have to put it in an animal feeding trough. I've never met anybody who said, that's my dream right there. So don't romanticize the situation. But remember, Jesus makes any vessel holy. See, just because it might have smelled gross, just because it might have been noisy, just because it might have been inconvenient, doesn't change that Jesus makes it holy. So we don't romanticize it, but we recognize the spiritual power that manifests in that place because of Jesus' presence. That is the change. That is the important part that we have to make sure resonates with us. But also, this didn't happen by accident. Micah was written 500 to 700 years before Jesus. So God had plenty of time to get a plan together. And we read this story of Luke, that there was a census that was taken that propelled these events into motion. So God was able to use the global empire that was Rome to fulfill his purposes. And if God could do that, I'm confident God could have gotten a better place for Jesus to stay for the night. So this didn't happen by accident. It's not as though God forgot to put that on his to-do list and it got neglected. This was an intentional decision. God could have made an easier spot for Jesus. He could have made Jesus and Mary and Joseph be in the most comfortable, ideal situation possible. But God was in complete control. And when we see Jesus being laid in a manger, knowing that God is in complete control, what that says to me is that no matter the chaos in my life, God is in control. No matter what's going on in me that seems to just frustrate me or discourage me or make me at my wits' end, God is in control. No matter what, I want to tell you that God is in control of your life, of your situation, and there is nothing that happens that's going to surprise him, that's going to get him off guard. There's nothing that happens that God can't handle. God is in control. This humble birth was part of God's purpose, and it was a plan for Jesus, and shows that he came in the most humble way. We refer to Jesus as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He could have come with a lot of pomp and circumstance. He could have come with all the glory of God. But God said, we're going to make you come in a humble way. And as I think about that, as Jesus coming in humility, lying in the manger, it makes me realize and remember that Jesus came to identify with us. He didn't come to have people pat him on the back. He didn't come so people could just be so amazed at who he was. He came to identify with you. He came to identify with me. And his humble brings that to focus today. But this is what we call the incarnation. The birth of Jesus is the incarnation. It's God coming with us. We use words like Emmanuel to say God is with us. See, Jesus made himself nothing so that we could be reconciled to God. And there are a lot of ways that we can say this birth scene in Luke chapter 2 foreshadows more to come in Jesus' life. And particularly, we can say it foreshadows his death. If we would assume that the manger was a wooden manger, and we can say, well, Jesus began his life with wood and ended his life with wood on the cross. We can see that Jesus is being foreshadowed, but Jesus bore the only cross that an infant can really bear. I mean, extreme poverty. The world was indifferent and was just didn't care about him. That's really the only crosses a healthy baby can have nothing and nobody care about you. And that's what happened. Jesus came not so that people would notice, but so he could identify with us. But Jesus makes any vessel holy. He can make the manger holy. He can make you holy. He can change the world and make it holy. In fact, we get to Revelation 21, 22, we see that, that happens. That God redeems, God restores, God reconciles through this Jesus who is the giver of life. So he's laid in a manger, and a manger is a place where they put animal food. Well, Jesus, another phrase we use to describe him, is the bread of life. We see stories in the gospel where Jesus feeds the 4,000, where Jesus feeds the 5,000. He says, I am the bread. We take communion. And we take communion, we take the bread and we take the juice, and we say, this is the body of Christ that is broken for you. We are talking about the spiritual sustenance that Jesus wants to give to us. Now, Jesus can provide for our physical needs, but it's our spiritual needs that he first and foremost came to meet. So just because he fed the 4,000 and the 5,000 with literal food, he came for more than that. He came for more than just to fulfill our temporary needs. He came to fulfill our eternal needs. And so this manger, I think in a lot of ways, it shows the hospitality that Jesus has for us. I think hospitality sometimes can get blown out of proportion. It's got to be extravagant. It's got to be perfect. Whenever you have planned visitors at your house, what do you do before they come? You clean. And I, at least from my office standpoint, I like having meetings every once in a while in my office because it forces me to clean. It forces me to organize and get things put away or taken care of. But Jesus, his hospitality is not to impress us. It's not to put up a false facade. His hospitality was rooted in the fact that he came to identify with us. I think that's really what hospitality is about, is showing others you care about them. Jesus came so that he could be with us. He could have had an elaborate entrance. He could have had all these things that were in his favor, but he did not. He came with all the smells, with all the earthiness, all the noise, all the distraction, all the being ignored from everybody else that you can imagine. He came so he could identify with us. But he's also, another phrase we refer to as Jesus, is he is the good shepherd. And so he is the shepherd who makes his bed among the sheep. And shepherds would frequently sleep with their sheep, and the sheep would know the shepherd, and the shepherd would know the sheep, and they'd be very comfortable with each other. So Jesus came to be with us, so we could know him, so we could be comfortable with him, so we could understand his voice and hear his voice and recognize his voice and know what he looks like and know what he smells like and know his touch. He came so that we could have that. In fact, we look at Scripture and we see that's a good portion of what the biblical story is about, of God coming to us. Read the Old Testament, when the Israelites are wandering in the desert, God lives, or his dwelling place is in the tabernacle, this tent that they move around the desert. And God created the tent and the tabernacle and the sanctuary inside of it and the Holy of Holies as his dwelling place so the people would know that God is with you. We get the ultimate God is with you revelation with Jesus. Through Jesus, we know God is with us. God is here. God is present. God is among us because of Jesus. And sometimes we can be surprised by that. And sometimes the people that we wouldn't expect are the ones that hear the message most clearly. And we see how that happens as we continue in the Gospel of Luke in verse 8, when that night there were shepherds staying in their fields nearby, guarding their flocks of sheep. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared among them, and the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. They were terrified. But the angel reassured them, "Do not be afraid," he said. "I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all the people. The Savior, yes, the Messiah, the Lord, has been born today in Bethlehem, the city of David. And you will recognize him by this sign. You will find a baby wrapped snugly in strips of cloth, lying in a manger." Suddenly the angel was joined by a vast host of others, the armies of heaven, glorifying God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth with those with whom God is pleased." When the angels returned to heaven, the shepherds said to each other, "Let's go to Bethlehem, and let's see this thing that has happened that the Lord has told us about." So they hurried to the village and found Mary and Joseph, and there was the baby lying in a manger. After seeing him, they told everyone what had happened and what the angel had told them about this child. All who heard the shepherd's story were astonished, but Mary kept all these things in her heart and thought of them often. The shepherds then returned to their flocks, glorifying and praising God for everything they had heard and seen. It was just as they had been told. So there's some speculation with the shepherds that I think can be a little bit intriguing, is that the shepherds were guarding flocks, were tending flocks of sheep that were used for temple sacrifices. Now, there's no definitive proof. This is kind of just something we try to connect the dots a little bit. Bethlehem was about 6 miles from Jerusalem, so we see that that's a pretty close proximity for Bethlehem to be a provider for the sacrificial animals. But the angel claimed that the Messiah had been born. And there are other parts of Scripture we see that people were expecting something. They were in expectation that the Messiah was coming or God was getting ready to do something. And I imagine the shepherds probably didn't grasp the full extent of what was happening. I don't think I would grasp the full extent of what was happening in the moment. But looking back, they probably knew enough to know that this was something special. That this was something that I don't want to miss. You know, even if it doesn't turn out to be true, I'm going to regret it my whole life if I don't check this out. So they knew that there was something special, knew it was something to go and see. So the angel tells them about the sign. Now the sign wasn't that the baby was wrapped in strips of cloth or swaddled or comfortable. That's normal. Right? A newborn baby, you swaddle the child. You put them in a blanket and you wrap them snugly. That makes them comfortable. It helps them relax. It helps them sleep. That wasn't the sign. The sign was that the child would be in the manger. Even in that world, that was a little out of the ordinary. And think of it today, that would be really weird today. And we might call the Department of Human Services to child welfare. But the reality is that was out of the normal for them. That would be the sign. And they may have been thinking, well, no king comes in this manner. You know, the Messiah who's going to come and lead Israel back to prominence, he's not going to come and be laid in a manger. You know, God's going to have a better plan than that. But they said, you know, we still got to check this out. We still got to go see what this is all about. See, the way that Jesus entered the world says a lot about his mission, about his purpose. Jesus didn't come so that we would just think highly of him. He came because we needed him. He came because we were estranged from God. He came so that we could be redeemed and reconciled. He came because there was a problem that only he could fix. He didn't come so we would say, "That boy Jesus." He came because he loved you. And so we come back to the sheep and the shepherds. And sheep were really important in the Old Testament sacrificial system, particularly lambs. And the Old Testament, what they would do is they would take newborn lambs that were unblemished. And you need an unblemished newborn lamb because that was as valuable as you could get. And that would be what you'd use for the sacrifice. But to make sure that the lamb remained calm and that it remained unblemished is that they would wrap the lamb in a blanket. They would keep it close so it couldn't move and lay it in a manger so that it would be calm and comfortable and warm and not get any blemishes on it. And so in the Old Testament time and continuing up to Jesus, we see that Bethlehem, as I said, probably was a place that supplied lambs and other animals for the sacrifices in Jerusalem. But the sacrifices, they have morning sacrifices, they had evening sacrifices, but the big one was that of Passover. And if you remember Passover from Exodus chapter 12, the Israelites are enslaved to the Egyptians, and God has brought 10 plagues on the Egyptians, saying, "Let my people go." And then he comes to the 10th. And the 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. And God sends the angel of death, and the angel enters every single household. And in every single household, the firstborn is killed. A very horrific day in Egypt, a very just difficult text to digest. But God gave the Israelites this message: if you put lamb's blood on your door frames, the angel of death will pass over and spare your house, so that no one in your household will be visited by the angel of death. And that's why the Jews celebrate Passover and that's why they call it Passover, because the angel of death passed over the homes that had the lamb's blood on the door frames. Jesus came so that death wouldn't have to be our reality. He came so that he is the sacrificial lamb who takes away the sins of the world, which is what John says. He came for that purpose so that death wouldn't have to be a reality in your life, that you could have life. The shepherds didn't necessarily know exactly what they were probably getting into. But they had no better opportunity to encounter the Messiah than at that moment. The angel had come to them and said, "The Messiah has been born in Bethlehem." And they're like, "We're right there. We need to go now." And we don't know any of the shepherd's story after this. I believe that they were changed. I believe that some of them probably went and made non-Jesus decisions or didn't follow Jesus, but some of them might have. But they were changed from that experience. What I'm getting at today is that you have no better opportunity to encounter Jesus than right here, right now. Jesus can make any vessel holy. But what I think we tend to do sometimes is we scrub and we clean and we pamper as much as we can so it looks acceptable. Well, Jesus didn't come just so you could have a clean, warm, dry spot to lay your head. Jesus came to transform your life. And the longer that we spend in the church, I think the easier it is to forget that, to realize that we need a continual transformation of Jesus in our lives. It's not something that just happened way back when in someplace over there. It's about now. But encountering Jesus right here and right now. Because no matter how perfect you are, Jesus still has work to do in your life. It's a matter of recognizing Jesus came in the most humble of ways, and he calls us to humbly come to him as well. Through Jesus, salvation has come. But it's not just about saying a few words and then waiting for Jesus to come back so we can get to heaven. It's about experiencing the transforming work of Jesus now. Jesus can make any vessel holy, and you have no better opportunity to experience Jesus than right here and right now.